September 26, 1939, was a day that marked the final collapse of Polish resistance in Warsaw, bringing to an end the valiant struggle of the Polish defenders against the overwhelming might of Nazi Germany. With the fall of Warsaw imminent, the full scale of the tragedy that had befallen Poland became starkly evident. As the remnants of Polish defense capitulated, the realities of occupation and the consequences of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact began to fully materialize. For the global audience, the day underscored the ruthlessness of the Nazi and Soviet regimes, the failure of appeasement, and the urgent need for the Allied powers to reconsider their strategies in the face of a rapidly expanding conflict. The fall of Warsaw, surrender and suffering. By September 26, the situation in Warsaw was untenable. After enduring weeks of relentless bombardment and encirclement, the city was in ruins. The massive air raids and artillery barrages conducted by the Germans had destroyed much of Warsaw's infrastructure, including hospitals, water supplies, and food storage. Fires raged uncontrolled throughout the city, and the civilian population was left with no shelter, food, or clean water. The humanitarian situation was dire, with thousands of civilians dead or wounded and the remainder suffering from starvation, dehydration, and disease. The Polish defenders, a mix of regular army units, militias, and civilian volunteers, had fought bravely but were now at the end of their tether. Under the command of General Walerian Chuma, they had mounted a heroic defense, but by September 26, it was clear that further resistance was futile. Mayor Stefan Starzyński, who had been a beacon of hope and resilience throughout the siege, continued to broadcast appeals to the citizens of Warsaw, urging them to hold on, but the tone had shifted. His final broadcasts acknowledged the inevitable fall of the city and praised the courage of its defenders and civilians. On September 26, the decision to surrender was made. The Polish command in Warsaw, realizing that continuing the fight would only lead to further needless deaths and destruction, opened negotiations with the Germans for a ceasefire and terms of surrender. German forces, eager to conclude the siege and move on to other objectives, agreed to the negotiations. The terms offered were harsh but predictable: unconditional surrender of all Polish forces in Warsaw, disarmament, and the occupation of the city by German troops. The surrender marked the end of organized Polish resistance in Warsaw. The city's defenders laid down their arms, and German forces moved in to take full control. For the people of Warsaw, the end of the siege brought a grim mix of relief and despair. While the immediate threat of further destruction was lifted, the reality of occupation under the Nazi regime promised a new chapter of suffering, marked by repression, forced labor, and the systematic dismantling of Polish society. Soviet consolidation in eastern Poland, tightening the grip. As Warsaw capitulated, the Soviet Union continued to consolidate its control over eastern Poland. Following the rapid advance of Soviet forces into the region after the invasion on September 17, Soviet authorities moved swiftly to establish their rule and integrate the territories into the Soviet state. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, played a crucial role in enforcing Soviet authority, conducting mass arrests, deportations, and executions to eliminate any potential resistance and to suppress nationalist sentiment. On September 26, Soviet authorities intensified their efforts to solidify control over eastern Poland. Local administrative structures were dismantled, and Soviet-appointed officials took over governance. The NKVD continued its campaign of repression, targeting anyone suspected of harboring anti-Soviet views or connections to the former Polish state. Thousands of Polish military officers, civil servants, intellectuals, and landowners were arrested and deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. German occupation, establishing order and enforcing control. In western Poland, the German occupation forces continued to assert their control over the territories they had conquered. With the Polish military effectively neutralized, the Wehrmacht focused on establishing a stable occupation regime that would serve both military and economic needs. The occupation was characterized by a combination of military presence, administrative restructuring, and economic exploitation. On September 26, German authorities implemented further measures aimed at consolidating their control over occupied Poland. Martial law remained in effect, and the Gestapo intensified its campaign of arrests and intimidation. The occupation authorities targeted not only those suspected of resistance, but also the broader Polish intelligentsia, whom they saw as potential leaders of future nationalist movements. This strategy was designed to suppress any possibility of organized resistance and to instill a sense of fear and helplessness among the Polish population. The economic exploitation of the occupied territories also intensified. Forced labor was imposed on the Polish population, with thousands being sent to work in German factories, farms, and other industries essential to the Nazi war effort. The German authorities continued their policy of Germanization, which involved the displacement of Polish populations and the resettlement of ethnic Germans in their place. This policy aimed to create a loyal German population in the newly acquired territories and to erase Polish cultural and national identity. German propaganda continued to frame the invasion and occupation of Poland as a defensive measure necessary to protect Germany from external threats and to secure its eastern borders. This narrative was used to justify the harsh measures being implemented in the occupied territories and to maintain domestic support for the war effort. For the Polish population, the German occupation represented a period of intense suffering, marked by violence, coercion, and systematic attempts to eradicate Polish identity. Allied response, strategic confusion and calls for action. With the fall of Warsaw and the complete occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, faced mounting pressure to respond more decisively. The rapid defeat of Poland underscored the failures of Allied policy and raised urgent questions about the future course of the war. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government was under increasing scrutiny for its handling of the crisis. Public opinion was growing more critical of the government's perceived failure to act decisively in defense of Poland, with many feeling that Britain had not fulfilled its obligations to its Polish ally. On September 26, the British War Cabinet continued to debate potential responses, including the possibility of increasing military aid to other nations threatened by Axis aggression and expanding economic sanctions against both Germany and the Soviet Union. However, logistical challenges and concerns about military readiness continued to constrain the British response. The Royal Air Force, RAF, remained focused on defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany in an effort to weaken the Nazi war machine through economic attrition. The British government also explored ways to support Polish forces that had escaped to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive even as Poland itself fell under occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. The complete occupation of Poland forced France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause in an increasingly hostile environment. The failure of the Allies to provide more substantial support to Poland highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of provoking a broader conflict before they were fully prepared, but this cautious approach also meant that Poland had been left to face the German and Soviet onslaught largely alone. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic recalculations. The continued occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces and the fall of Warsaw prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 26, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 26, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 26th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the fall of Warsaw and the firm establishment of Soviet control in eastern Poland with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 26, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a further descent into occupation and repression, as the fall of Warsaw and the complete occupation of the country became a reality. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 26, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the fall of Warsaw and the continued consolidation of Soviet control over eastern Poland highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War. The events of this day underscored the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability.